Hey folks, thanks for listening to podcasts about Catholic things. I'm Eric, the ambassador of common sense, and I'm here with Dan Engel.
Hello everyone, I'm the ambassador of nonsense.
And we got Jason with us today. I don't know what Jason's the ambassador of.
Hey
Jason?
folks,
You need to pick
I
something.
don't really.
The ambassador of 50 cents.
I'm more like, I don't know, just a visitor. I wouldn't say ambassador necessarily. Yeah.
I would say ambassador of 50 cents. I think that's who you are now. Okay.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming.
Yeah, finally.
Yeah, we've been trying to get Jason to do. Originally, Jason's the one that I talked to try to get with him to do a podcast. But
I was second choice.
Danny was second choice. He's what I wanted is someone I could sound slightly smarter than, and Danny sounds slightly smarter than me. So I was like, I don't want Danny because he's going to steal the show. But Jason, I always sound slightly smarter than.
Well, you're in for a treat because I will make you sound very smart. I assure you of that.
Thanks. All right, we're doing a debate this week. The old reception of communion on the tongue or on the hands. Does it matter? And which one should we be doing?
Yeah. So that's and Jason is if I understand has tried to look into it a lot to figure out whether he should care, I suppose, but hasn't formed a strong opinion. So I was thinking maybe he could be a moderator of the debate rather than participating.
Yeah, it's funny. I was thinking about it since you mentioned what topic you're going to choose, and I think God sort of decided for me today. I have a pretty good story about Mass, but I don't want to. I want to talk about it for a while first. So why don't we dig in and then you guys talk? But then it's pretty. I don't know I don't know what to call it, but we'll go to that later.
All right, we'll work it in. So let me first of all, I want to see if we can kind of clarify our positions. So if the way I see it, there's four basic types of positions a person could have with regards to this issue. And they represent in some of those a spectrum, but the one position could be that one way is so clearly, not even clearly, but so superior to the other, the one mode so superior to the other, whichever you pick, communion on the tongue, on the hand, whatever, so superior that the church should only allow that. That's one kind of position. The other kind of position is that, well, this is the way that is superior, and the church should encourage it, but it's not so superior as to be able to say that the other one is wrong, and therefore the church should allow both. But when it gets down to kind of like personal decision making, well, this way is superior. And then the third is there's neither way is superior to the other. And then there's kind of a fourth kind of position that you could take, and it's similar to the third, but the fourth position is neither way is superior to the other. However, the church should pick one and only allow that as a way of expressing unity sacramentally, because this is the highest and holiest sacrament. Okay. So those are kind of the four types of positions. And then, of course, on the two of them within the spectrum, there's really twice as many, because you could pick either one to be the superior. So I'm kind of let's at least define where we fall on the spectrum so that we know, what we really are going to be debating.
Okay. I think I'm on the third.
There's no difference.
I don't think there's a difference between the hand and the mouth. It's not to say that I don't know how to put this into words. I guess my position is that as long as both of them are done reverently, it doesn't matter which one it is.
Mm-hmm.
And
Okay.
that's where I stand.
Okay. I'm, and I'll make this clear. I'm of the opinion that the church should go back to the universal norm of receiving only on the tongue, and that should actually be enforced as a norm, not just encouraged as a superior mode of receiving.
So you believe that mode is superior?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, just for the record, I went to bed last night and I was, I guess, in line with what Eric said. I was, your third description there. I didn't feel like there was a big difference one way or the other, but again, we'll get to it later, but I may be changing my position on that. But go ahead.
So how do we want to do this? And we haven't even discussed a format for how we would do debates or anything like that.
I don't think it matters. I think we should just talk about it. But first, I want to. I don't want to insult anyone, but I want to get the one out of the way that I know you will not make this argument, and I know you won't make this argument, but I think we should talk about it because a whole lot of people do make the argument.
Are going to think about it? Okay, well, let's go ahead.
And that is that I'm not worthy to put my hands on the Eucharist.
Okay. Any more than you're worthy, I guess, to, receive the Eucharist on your tongue.
Right.
However, it's kind of interesting. You bring that up, but I will be bringing out something that is mistakable for that if you're not careful about the distinctions. So,
okay, well, let's talk about that.
Well,
okay,
I want to let me interject real quick before you go too far. What about a quick history? I mean, at some point, the church took that receiving on the tongue as the norm, right? So, how and when did that happen?
Well, I'll say that what I've been able to find, and it's hard to do research on that. It's not like you can just find relevant, consistent, non-conflicting references to first sources that show clearly this is what happened when and so forth. But as far as I can tell, there at some point the church adopted it as a universal norm, mainly because they were seeing opportunities for abuse when the priest was not maintaining complete control of the host into the recipient's mouth. And so, the church, out of a concern for that, said, okay, we're just going to do it this way. But that practice wasn't, that's not the introduction of the practice. The practice itself seems to have existed. In fact, both practices seem to have existed side by side, from what I can tell, even into ancient first century Christianity. But like I said, it's really hard to pin down.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of think that, and this is kind of a hypothesis, that somebody who was a Christian history, PhD student might go research as part of as part of a dissertation, they might research this, which would be that perhaps in the early Christian church, those who had come in from the Jews were those who were more likely to do something like reserve reception of the Eucharist on the tongue alone. The Jews, as a people, were very used to the idea of things being set apart and that being the meaning of being sacred, and then only something that was consecrated to do so would be allowed to touch that. So, for example, they would have the scroll where the Torah was written, and when they would read it at synagogue or whatever, the rabbi or whoever was reading it would have a special wand that he could use as a pointer so that his finger never had to touch the scroll as he was reading, as a placekeeper or whatever. And you see that in a lot of ways, in a lot of other contexts in biblical passages, that they're very sensitive to this thing about something being consecrated and therefore set apart, and therefore you don't touch it unless you're consecrated to do so. So
Mm-hmm.
I could see that, and that would be a thing that developed from specifically Jewish converts in early Christianity that didn't necessarily, wasn't necessarily the full norm everywhere at first during that time.
Okay.
So and then, for a time, that was the universal norm. And then sometime around the 60s and 70s, it started popping up as, my understanding of this history is that it would crop up as kind of local practices at first, and then gradually the Vatican started granting sort of a indult. In fact, it still is an indult to receive on the tongue, or on the hand rather. It's the norm is on the tongue. It's a grant of special permission to receive on the hand, but it was only supposed to be granted to those countries in which it was already being practiced. So that's my...
Do you know where that is? I mean, what...
Where I could look that up?
Yeah.
I could find that. It was like one of the Paul VI, I think,
Okay.
things that did that. I'd have to go do some research to dig that up. The specific, aspect of the recent history, to me, I know that people will bring up things like, well, it was supposed to be this, and then, some degree of,
Kind of like Saturday Mass.
disingenuity and stuff like that was brought up, and then it became, all over the place. Well, people will use that as a way of arguing against communion in the hand. I don't think that part of the history is necessary to my argument. That's why I don't really have, those points at my fingertips. So I don't know if you have any other, if you've done some research, if you have any other historical items to add.
Since you brought it up.
I don't. I didn't. Okay. I've never really done that sort of research. The type of thinking and studying I've been doing is I don't know, I guess based on, I guess I didn't really do any historical research, but I sort of always thought there was an element of, how the old hosts, the old bread were flaky and crumbs would go all over the place, and now we have these new manufactured hosts that supposedly don't, drop crumbs.
You say that as though any of us is that old. I mean, I know I'm your older brother, but I'm not that old, Jason.
I'm just saying.
I don't know when they started mass producing the wafers, but
it was way before any of us received Holy Communion.
Yeah, before we did, but I would think that like our mothers would have gotten it that way. Do you think, or our grandparents?
No. I
really?
I think for most of the 20th century, the wafers have been mass produced. I don't think parishes during any significant part of the 20th century in the United States. I want to clarify that because I don't know about other places of the world, but in the United States, I don't think parishes were there baking unleavened communion bread during most of the 20th century. I could be wrong about that. I'd like to have some information and context about that, but I think that during maybe even most of the industrial age, that those have been kind of more on the mass-produced side.
But on receiving on the tongue predates the industrial age by far.
Right. Yes. Like I said, I think first century is probably when I think you'd even find that practice back then.
So you go back then, and you've got this piece of bread that crumbles, and you got crumbs going all over.
Yeah.
They probably received it on the mouth, and they probably also used something to... Well, we know for a long time they've been using something to catch the crumbs as it went from the plate to the mouth.
Right. And there may have been different ways of doing it. I mean, I know that also there was in tincture where they would dip the particle into the precious blood, and then
Right,
delivered
that was
them
kind
out.
of an Eastern practice.
Yeah, the
wasn't it?
Byzantines still do that to this day.
Well, they still do
as far
that,
as
but I
understand
think
it.
a lot of early Christians did that. In fact, there's even an indication in the Gospel of John that that's how Jesus gave communion to Judas, and perhaps that's how he gave it to all the apostles. I don't know.
Well, I
But
don't want to be like Judas.
no, okay.
Well,
Here's what's interesting. Judas is the only apostle that we have a biblical record of Jesus giving communion to specifically. The others he said, take this and eat it, but in Judas specifically, he said the one who betrays me is the one to whom I give the morsel. Well, he dipped the morsel and then gave it to Judas. Well, having dipped the morsel, he probably didn't hand it to Judas. He probably put it in his mouth.
It would be pretty sloppy if he didn't.
That's exactly. So I'm thinking
I thought it said the one who dips his bread with me.
it says that in one of the other synoptic gospels, but in John, it says the one to whom I give the morsel.
Oh.
Now, how do we reconcile that? Is it, I think there's probably a little bit of the slop in the wording, and either one could be slightly incorrect. I don't know. But
Yeah.
my thinking is, going back to, I forget who brought it up, but you would have had some kind of plate to catch the fragments. Well, that so-called catcher of the fragments might have been, in many cases, the chalice itself, if you were
Which
doing
would
it by
catch the
intention.
drops, not just the fragments.
Exactly.
But if you... Okay, let's take the drops out for a second. You're talking about breadcrumbs.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the thing they use is this... it's not that big. It's this circle of metal, and it's flat, and it's not at all like a dish.
Oh, you mean the ones
And-
that we use today?
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you drop a crumb on that, I can't see it staying on that.
Oh, any slight waft of air would.
Blow it to the
Yes.
floor.
Or
Yes.
just bounce. If it's big enough to be called a crumb instead of dust, therefore having the accident of the Eucharist, then it's, I would think, more likely to bounce and be lost than if you just put it in someone's hand.
Possibly. Now, I can say this.
What's that thing
I'm
called?
trying to think.
Paten? Mom always talks about it.
I think it's called the paten. Yeah. But I think I've actually seen exactly one time in my entire life somebody fumble the host distributing it on the tongue, and it was at a place where they were using the paten, and it was caught by the paten.
Oh.
Huh.
Now here's the thing that's significant. I've only seen that happen exactly one time distributing on the tongue. I've seen lots and lots of times of it being dropped distributing in the hand. Now, that's not necessarily an argument because, well, it's probably distributed on the hands about, 50 to 70 times as often as it's distributed on the tongue. So, it's...
Well, I can, in my own anecdotal, when I was in grade school, I always received on the tongue.
Oh, really?
And it was dropped
get
on
after you
me.
about that?
No, in second grade, actually, they were teaching us how, and I said, what if we want to do it by tongue? And she said, did St. Peter and St. Paul receive it on the tongue? I said, well, I don't know, but I'm not St. Peter or St. Paul.
I'm not an apostle.
But I was, you know how I am. It was
Eric
obvious she didn't want me to do
precisely
it.
because they were all receiving it on the hand.
That's
Yeah.
right.
I did. So, precisely because I knew the teacher didn't want me to. So I was like, well, I'm just going to go on the tongue from now on.
Yeah.
And I did. And I think it was 6th grade, maybe 7th, it was dropped on me.
So, how tall were you?
I was not that tall at that age.
Okay. And
The one who was giving it to me, probably maybe a tiny bit taller.
Not the priest?
No, it was, you know who it was.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's
So it does happen. I know it happens.
Yeah.
And if the paten had been there, I
Would
just
it have
don't
caught
see
it?
it having. I don't see it happening.
So did he
entire
fumble it or
college?
what?
Was he a science teacher?
No, religion. And
Okay.
language arts and stuff like that. I shouldn't say stuff like that. Religion is not like language arts, but you know, we tend to group those things. I think religion should be taught by science teachers personally, but
Yeah, I do too. Anyway, the point is, but it doesn't really matter because I don't think the paten was there to catch things that have been fumbled.
you think it was there to catch crumbs?
The crumbs that have fallen. Because if a crumb is big enough, to where it has the appearance of bread, then it is still the Eucharist.
I would not even say that. I would say if the crumb is sufficiently big to have the form of bread, which is not necessarily strictly indicated by appearance. In other words, it can be too small to see as bread, but yet contain the form of bread. I would say in fact, I think this...
The word they use is accident.
Yeah, under
I
the
was
accidents
looking that
of bread
up
and wine.
when you guys... everybody started way early on me. I was going to look this stuff up after I got back from Mass. And all of a sudden, my phone's going off. I'm like... And all of a sudden, Danny's voice just booms over the speakers because I hadn't switched it to the headphones. So... but anyway, the accident is the word they use.
Right.
Council of Trent, I think. But I don't quite understand what they mean by accident of bread.
Well,
so you're saying even though it's small enough to not appear as bread, but it still has the form of bread.
Right.
And when does it no longer have that?
So here's the way I would see it. So I think modern science has been tremendous in helping to deepen and clarify some of these ideas. So the way I understand the theology is that the entire substance of what was once bread becomes the person of Christ. And that person of Christ is fully present in that form and in every particle and fragment of that form until it no longer has the form of bread. And when we can think of it as either being disintegrated, through environmental or digestive processes. So having the form of bread means that it interacts with its environment as bread would. So if you could analyze it and through analysis come back with an answer that this is bread, then it's still actually the person of Christ.
So in your understanding of this, dust from the wafers is still the body and blood of Christ.
Even
right.
if you can't see it.
Right. In fact, I was a EMHC at Holy Rosary Church, and I would distribute communion on a given weekend to anywhere from 70 to 150 people or whatever. But as I distributed communion, and this is where I first really started realizing the degree to which this idea of this this cardstock wafer and being something that secures it against fragmentation really is a misunderstanding, that it's not like that. Because as I would distribute communion, I would feel grains of fragments from the wafers build up between my finger and thumb. And so afterwards I would go up to the tabernacle. There was a little dish of water there that I could ablute my finger and thumb in, which later would be dumped into the sacrarium back in the sacristy. But that's the thing that really got me to thinking about this. Even with our modern ways of manufacturing the wafers, any given time that I pick up the host and put it somewhere on my tongue or somebody else's tongue or somebody else's hands, whatever, there's a chance that some particle of that, large enough to feel, would end up between, on either the pad of my thumb or the pad of my finger. Now, until I actually did this enough to where, there's multiple particles here and I can feel them, and wow, those are Christ. And, until I was an EMHC, I would not have noticed a single particle because, you don't feel that stuff. So any of those particles, and in my mind, that's Christ as long as it's large enough to say analyze as bread. That's Christ, and it's left in my pocket when I put my hands in my pocket, left on the missalette or the songbook when I pick it up when I get back to my pew, or whatever. That's what kind of got me to really thinking hard about, all right, where does this happen? And, the thing is, if we say here's why I really think that the theology lands on the side of, if it retains the form of bread, irrespective of visibility or size, it's still Christ, because any other answer becomes an arbitrary thing that we can't nail down. Because if you say, well, if it's large enough to be bread, well, I mean, is the wafer we receive at communion large enough to be bread?
Right.
Well, what about a tongue? What about a tiny piece? You pick a tiny piece off and give it to some people because, maybe they can only handle a tiny piece because they have celiac disease, but not so bad you need a special one. Or like in the Eastern Church, in some Eastern churches, maybe all of them, they actually give all 3 sacraments of initiation to infants, including Holy Communion. They would actually take a tiny piece of the host, a tiny fragment, and put it in the baby's mouth, and then the baby, eventually would dissolve that and hopefully swallow some of it.
Do they continue that every Sunday?
No. And then later, there's a point at which they receive their first ceremonial communion, as a receiver of communion when they've reached the age of reason. But it's given as part of baptism and confirmation one time when they're infants.
Okay.
Well, I think they continue to take it. I mean, you said the age of reason, but what it's like 3 or 4, isn't it?
Oh, is it 3 or 4? Is that early?
Yeah, I'm pretty
we
sure
think in terms of 7 or 8.
Well, and I'm more or less thinking about the Byzantine church that I've heard recently in another podcast that how they do that. But anyway.
Oh, okay.
So Eric's point, I guess, in the beginning was that the tiny pieces, you can't see them, so they're no longer the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Christ. And so, Eric, is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that was my argument. Again, I didn't have time to look up the accident of
what that.
And you know what? So it says an accidental property.
Right. Those are the properties.
The union of 2 concepts, property and contingency.
Right.
In the philosophy where these kinds of dogmas were
and contingency just means it's not essential to the thing itself. But think about things like when let's say you take bread out of the oven and you you could taste the bread, you could smell the bread. These are accidents. The taste of it, the smell of it are accidents of the bread. They are not the breadness itself. And furthermore, or if you open up a loaf of Wonder or something like that has a certain smell and a taste, might be different from other bread, or like unleavened bread, or like a cracker, which I think is pretty similar to unleavened bread or whatever. These things have a certain, a crispness, a feel, a shape, a color, a taste, or at least an experience within the mouth that maybe is not strictly taste, but maybe has to do with how quickly it softens under your saliva and stuff like that. All of these things are accidents of the bread. They're not the breadness itself. So the thing is, we can keep getting more and more detailed, and we can keep more and more saying, okay, but which of these accidents tell us this is bread or this is not? And so the accidents include not only those things that we perceive directly with our senses, but also those things that we perceive through the use of instruments that try to extend our senses. A microscope, for example, or a chemical test, for example. And so therefore we get to the point where we can say, okay, wait a minute. Now we can talk about what really would constitute the form of bread is having particular accidents, particular, it has gluten in it from the flour, or it has maybe not gluten. I understand they can make hosts for people with celiac disease or whatever, but the thing is, certain elements of the flour and that are transformed with the water and then have undergone some kind of a baking that further transforms them, and they result in certain chemical structures. These are the true accidents that make this have the form of bread. So then, when those accidents go away, the form of bread ceases to exist, and that is no longer Christ if it's, been consecrated.
If you're going to get that far into it, there's absolutely no way to save things like dust particles and stuff like that from ending up on the floor, with a paten or without a paten.
And distributed on the tongue or the hand. And so that's where I say, okay, we take the greatest care that we can reasonably.
Okay,
so
but
we
reasonably
say, is it unreasonable to ask people to say, okay, kneel down so that your head is at a position that it makes it easy for the priest to do this, and then open your mouth and allow the priest to place the host on your tongue. The priest, having been trained in such things, knows to keep his thumb and finger together as he's going between the plate.
I maintain that it is
stuff like that.
Unreasonable, because as our understanding of the accidents of bread have increased, our understanding of reasonableness when it comes to putting your thumb in someone else's mouth have also increased. And while we see these tiny particles now and can say this is bread, what's reasonable has changed because we also understand germs and disease and a lot of other things.
Well, you can say that, but I mean, they understood that you shouldn't hug lepers, but Jesus did that.
That was just a command in the Bible, but
I don't know if germs are. So you're saying that because of the spread of germs, flus, and things like that, it's another
unreasonable
reason.
I would say that's one reason that makes it unreasonable.
It's something that makes it unreasonable for somebody to open their mouth and allow the priest to place the host on their tongue.
Not just because he's putting his fingers in your mouth or that he's getting your spit on his fingers, but that he's also going on to the next person and doing the same thing. Yeah. And the first guy who has communion is now giving everything he has to everyone else in the church, or everyone else who's served by that priest.
So let me ask this. When you say it's unreasonable to expect people to do this, and I think sometimes we have a good understanding of germs. I think sometimes what's the word I would say? We get a little bit too hung up on it. But when you say it's unreasonable, do you mean that if that was the only way that you could receive communion, you would not do that?
No, I wouldn't say that personally because I don't even wash my hands before eating. But
you can see how
I know an awful lot of
yeah.
people. I mean, some people are kind of nuts about it. But if I think in this day and age it is unreasonable to expect that, that's not to say they wouldn't receive it. I just believe that's an undue hardship.
Okay.
I don't think these dust particles are little Jesuses floating down onto the ground, and if they are, then they're going to be there anyway.
To some extent. Like I said, we take what care we can. So, and like I said...
Okay, so what if we had this giant... I don't know. What if we could take more care than just using the paten and going on the tongue? We could have some kind of vacuum there to suck up any air that fell, and we could have that as an instrument at the church.
Yeah, and your argument is that such a thing, obviously I would say, well, that's unreasonable. And you say, well, it's no less reasonable than asking somebody to open their mouth and let the priest place it on his tongue.
Right. And again, I still think the paten itself, it just doesn't seem like it accomplishes much, because if it were crumbly, it would fall off the paten just as easily as it would fall on the floor if you put it in someone's hand. Because if you put it in someone's hand, now they've got control over it, and they can, if there's any crumbs there, they can see it, and they could put them in their mouth.
If they see it.
If they can't see it, I maintain that that is not the body of Christ.
Okay, so you think that the theology is that it only retains the form of bread and continues to be...
If we see it as bread.
If it has the accidents of bread as perceivable by unaided senses.
That's what I believe.
Okay, I don't know that the church has defined that level or not.
No, they haven't. Because that's what I was looking up. That's what I was looking up when we started.
There is a school of theological thought that says that. But like I said, if you do that, I feel like that's arbitrary, because somebody might say, "Oh, that's obvious to me that that's bread." Little crumbs on my fingertips, and somebody else, well, how could you possibly tell? Yeah, it looks white and crumbly, but you only know that it's part of the fragment from the host because you just touched the host. If you hadn't just touched the host, you wouldn't know what it was. Well,
you would think it's dirt.
The same thing could be said of a particle that's, like I said, we break a tiny particle off, maybe give it to a baby or something like that. The same thing could be said of that. If we didn't see it come off the larger host and we just kind of happened upon that, would we have any way without, with the unaided senses of knowing that that's bread? Well, probably not. Does that mean that person didn't actually receive communion? That's the kind of that's the arbitrariness that I think you risk with something like that.
To me, that's no more arbitrary than saying it's unreasonable to use a vacuum to suck up these little particles to keep them from falling on the ground. But even then, your vacuum's going to have a filter, and I can imagine things getting past that filter, and who knows where that's going.
Well, not a HEPA filter. I think a HEPA filter can filter out something like down to
then what do you do with that?
Well, then you wash it out.
I guess you got to wash it out in the aquarium. You need to tell, for those who don't know, that is a sink that goes directly into the ground instead of the sewer.
Right, I should have clarified that.
So they wash off the paten and the chalice and things like that. They use that to wash it off so that we're not dumping Jesus into the sewer.
Right, it goes straight into the ground, and that's where the host then, the accidental form of bread is decomposed by natural elements, and then it ceases to be Jesus, and so on and so forth. Well,
putting aside the practices of I guess preserving the host and the body of Christ physically, what about the effects of the reverence we show on the general congregation, and how people end up long term, habitually come to recognize that part of the Mass, based on those standards? Do you think that should be taken into consideration?
Well, I think it should. And that kind of plays into what I had said earlier, that there's a part of my argument that has to do with this idea of touching the person of Christ, and it's not to say that touching the person of Christ is inherently wrong. In fact, even in times when the church has, particularly required communion on the tongue, there's evidence that there has been exception given to cases during persecution where the priest would, not knowing that he was going to be back for a long time, he would consecrate, a number of fragments, and so he would leave those with people, and then they would touch them to communicate themselves, actually, in his absence until he was able to return, because he didn't know when he might be back. So in times of persecution, there was a general exception and a general understanding that the goodness that was received from the sacrament outweighed the presumption of touching the person of Christ, and so we would want people to do that in that situation, understanding what they're doing and why they're doing it, and so on and so forth. But I kind of think of the incident with the woman that had the hemorrhage, and this is recorded in several of the Gospels. She had a hemorrhage, and she went and she touched the cloak of Jesus, and she was healed. Now, in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus just, said, he turned to her. It only says what he said to her: "Daughter, take heart, your faith has cured you." But in the other two Gospels where it's recorded, the Gospel of Mark and the Gospel of Luke, after she touched him, Jesus started, he knew what had happened, of course, he willed it to happen, but he started going through the crowd saying, "Who touched me?" Now, of course, everybody was touching him, but they were touching him accidentally. They didn't take on themselves the presumption of touching him for a purpose. And this woman had done that. And he started asking, he's going around and questioning. And the woman, it says she knew what she had done, or realized what she had done. Well, what she had done was taken on this presumption to touch the person of Jesus. And he didn't just let her go on her way cured. He made her face him and made her go through an experience of contrition, and then said, "Take heart, your faith has cured you."
But she had been cured before he did that.
Yes, she was cured before he did that, but he, because he willed that power to go out of him, and then he turned around and made her go through that experience of facing him because she had done that. She had taken that presumption on herself. Most of the other people that Jesus cured, they came to him and they begged and said, "Jesus, have mercy on me, have pity on me," and so on and so forth. Even the centurion who met Jesus, at the edge of town, I'm not worthy that you come to my house, but I know that if you command it, my servant will be cured. But this woman, she went and she touched him herself. She touched the person of Jesus, and that was a presumption that she did, that he didn't take her to task in the sense of words.
I don't understand why this is how this pertains to what we're talking about.
Well, because I think Danny's point is she took it upon herself to touch him. I don't want to say in an unworthy manner, but I see what you're trying to say.
It was presumptive. That's right. That's the point. Is that it was presumptive. And
it's
so
not presumptive.
When we have an opportunity, we can receive the Holy Eucharist, and we can receive it on the tongue, we can receive it on our hands. We have a choice to do one or the other. I think that if people aren't thinking carefully about what is going on, they're following into that same presumptive pattern. Oh yeah, Holy Eucharist. Oh yeah, I'll just grab it and put it in my mouth. And then what you see all kinds of abuses. You see people who will carry it back to their place without consuming it, not even necessarily knowing what it is. If they're like visiting with a friend who didn't bother to tell them, well, you can't go to communion. But then you also see people, and I ran into this as an EMHC, who say, "Oh, I want an extra one for my mother back at home." Well, I can't give him that. The priest has to, you can't just give those out like that. But people are presumptive about this because of the casualness of receiving in the hand. And so when they receive in the hand, they're just exercising this presumption, and they kind of lose a sense of the sacredness of what's going on.
If they are that far, I would say that this is a problem of education.
Right, but one could argue that the norm is part of the education.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now I'll tell you what. There's only one other argument that I have, and without the clear definition of the church on the level of, when exactly does a particle cease to have the accidents of bread? Is it when you can't distinguish bread, with the naked senses or whatever? Without clear definition of the church on that, now I should research to see if there is at least indication. But you've got a pretty good argument with regards to the dust and the particles and that kind of stuff. It's kind of like, I guess what you could say is, well, it's up in the air. And my thinking would be, well, until the church has told us, why take the chance? But the other thing that I think of is this, that I think communion on the tongue more perfectly reflects the sacramental nature of Holy Communion, that we are receiving Christ and entering into a union with Christ through the ministry of the priest, and not through our own power in any sense whatsoever. So for us to momentarily
you don't pick up the host.
Well, we pick it up from our hand.
It is put in your hand.
Right, and then you
receive it in your hands. So.
Yeah, we receive it in our hand, and then we take control of it and receive it into our mouth. Now, here's the thing: until we actually swallow the host, it's when we swallow it that we've received Holy. Sorry, I just bumped my mic. It's when we swallow it that we've actually received Holy Communion. So now, obviously, the priest can't shove it down our throats with his thumb. But to place it in our mouth is proximate to the reception of Holy Communion, and so we're receiving it, we can say, directly from the priest. Whereas if he puts it in our hand, we attain control of it, and then under our control, it goes into our mouth, and then we receive Holy Communion sacramentally.
Well, we could say that about the chalice as well. As a matter of fact, that's why it bothers me when people take the chalice. That's actually
that's another thing that bothers me too.
Because then you are not receiving the blood.
You're communicating
the chalice.
Yourself. Yeah.
You're taking it.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, if your hands are out, your hands are open, and the priest puts it into your hand, you are receiving it. Now, whether he puts it on your hand or your tongue, I don't know that one is better than the other.
Well, what I would say is you're receiving, on your hand, you're receiving the wafer, the person of Christ, and on your tongue, you're more proximately, more directly receiving the sacrament of Holy Communion, which involves in consuming the person of Christ. So that's to me the distinction. That on the one case, you're receiving the person of Christ, but not directly receiving the sacrament of Holy Communion. On the other case, you're receiving the sacrament of Holy. Because when he puts it in your hand, you haven't received Holy Communion.
When he puts it in your tongue, you haven't received Holy Communion.
You proximately.
You're closer.
Unless you're going to spit it back.
So you're closer to it either way.
Unless you're going to.
I think you do receive the sacrament when it's given to you.
No, that's because if you receive it in your hand and then you don't consume it, you haven't received the sacrament. So when you receive it on your tongue, the only way to at that point to not receive the sacrament is to spit it back out of your mouth.
Okay.
So that's why I say it's more proximately, more perfectly not absolutely, but more perfectly representative of the nature of the sacrament itself to receive on the tongue than in the hand.
Okay.
That would be my argument. That in fact, that's the extent of my argument. I only had the three arguments. The one having to
I
do
don't
with the
have
particles.
a very good argument against that, other than to say that it's not really required to get as close as possible to that reception in the sacrament.
No, not required. Like I said, it more fully reflects the nature of the sacrament.
That is true.
That's my point. That's like I said, that only goes to, what I would say is a certain aesthetic superiority, if you could think of it that way.
Mm-hmm. For looks, huh?
Well, I think without a doubt, receiving it on the tongue certainly diminishes the opportunity for abuse, whether intentional or accidental. I don't think that you can argue against that.
I mean, if you're planning to abuse the host,
well,
I don't think putting it on your tongue is going to keep it from doing it. Except I did once see a woman with her 3 kids there, and she went up to communion. She came back, had the host in her hand, and broke it up into 3 pieces and gave 1 piece to each of the kids who ate it.
So she communicated the kids. Probably they hadn't received Holy Communion yet, right?
Right, they were
unless
like
they were
babies.
of a different rite.
No, they were babies.
I know. Again,
well, even in a different rite, you wouldn't have done that, though.
I don't.
No, you wouldn't.
I don't suspect so. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, that's.
Well, so that's a case right there. I mean, I don't think
if she had gotten it on her tongue, she
to
wouldn't have done that
necessarily. Yeah. But she couldn't have done that necessarily unless she'd spit it out. And well, I just think it's funny. So today I went to Mass this morning at St. Maximilian Kolbe, and I don't know if either of you
were up in
Westchester.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, that's right.
I've never been there.
We used to go there a lot.
It's like one of the mega churches is the only way I can explain it. I mean, it's literally 7 or 8 times the size of our parish down at St. Bernard of Clairvaux. So we went there today. It just worked out better that Mass time. So back to why.
So who's your pastor, real quick? Or did you pick up the name of the pastor there?
No, I didn't, because it was a priest who I don't think he lives there.
Normally there?
I think he jumps around. He's I don't know if you've ever seen him in the area. He's from Uganda. He's a real heavy accent.
Ah, okay.
Is that guy who I see at Mercy Hospital sometimes?
Yes. I can't think of his name. Gosh, and he's down.
I remember he's kind of conservative.
Yes, I'd say so. I mean, he has some pretty good stories, but today he starts his homily off discussing black masses and
oh wow,
and how people would steal, and he goes in to talk about devil worshiping, and he said it's actually getting more and more widespread in like Uganda and other parts of the world, and even in the United States a little bit. But anyway, I just thought it was a funny coincidence that, we're talking about the host and receiving it in your hand or on the tongue, and then he goes in to talk about this black mass, which
that came up today.
Obviously, again, they could still do it. They could keep it in their mouth. They could wait until they're out of the way and then put it in a napkin or whatever. So you could still certainly take the host for the purpose of desecrating it in the tongue, but it's a little more difficult. Much easier to do it by hand. So during communion, I mean, it is a very large church, so they have, I think it was something like 26, maybe even more, distributors.
Yeah.
It was a lot. And so first off, when I went up to receive communion, I just out of coincidence, again, or God made all this happen, he had picked up a piece that must have been part of the original host,
Oh, the one that he fragments?
The one that he fragmented, yeah. Which, I mean, it looked like a 10-inch Frisbee. It's huge up there, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So he must have broke it all up and then put it in different trays. You know, it didn't all go into his tray because this distributor had one of the pieces. And as he was holding it up, you could see particles falling off of it.
Oh,
so,
wow.
Really?
Yeah. So I thought that was kind of funny because I'd always thought, you know, with the host being nice and tight, you don't have a lot of big chance. So now those particles obviously were falling onto other pieces, which he's going to pick up, and who knows where they're going to end up, you know. So I saw that. Then after I get back to my pew, the distributor from the front of the church walked back to this area where we were, which is like halfway up the aisle, to empty their tray into the other distributors, because I guess they were running low or whatever. Well, as they were dumping these in, a host fell and rolled, you know, on the floor and like came, I don't know, within like 2 or 3 inches of a little kid stepping on it.
Ooh.
So this all happened today.
Oh,
that we just happened to be going to go and talk about this. Anyway, I thought that was kind of funny, but I can certainly see why or how, whether intentional or not, receiving it on the hand or letting so much control into the congregation handling the body of Christ can get out of hand. That's my only point.
If nothing else, receiving it on the tongue, if it was designated as the norm, would give a better appearance of how special it is.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
In fact, I kind of wonder, I should do some research into the history of church architecture, but I kind of wonder if had the norm of receiving it on the tongue been retained, like it actually is still the universal norm, and receiving it on the hand still is an indult. But had that not been so widely granted, had that indult not been so widely granted, I wonder if churches would not have at least retained the possibility, because you see so many churches today where if they wanted to go back to a system of receiving at a communion rail, it would be almost impossible because of the design of the church.
Yeah.
It wouldn't
And to
work.
me, I think that more than even the question of receiving on the tongue or on the hand, I think having a communion rail would actually be a benefit to, you know, some of these problems of getting people to think about what they're doing.
Yeah. One more question.
Mm-hmm.
Can you bite the host?
I think you can. In fact, I would say, I mean, I know that people talk about, well, particles stuck in your teeth and stuff, and what if you sneeze right afterwards? Okay, those are exceptional situations. But here's what I keep going back to in the Gospel of John. John is the only gospel that doesn't have what we call the institution narrative of Jesus actually turning bread and wine into his body and blood. But he has the Eucharistic sermon where he tells people, hey, if I am the bread of life, the bread that I give is my flesh for the life of the world. He who eats my flesh and drinks my blood, and so on and so forth. Well, the thing is, he says this like 3 different times, like one right after the other. Every time he says it, he uses a more physical word. So, when we read it in English, he just says eat and uses that same word over and over. But in the original language, as I understand it, he uses the word, we might maybe translate it into consume or swallow, and then next he uses the word that we might translate it into
chew.
something, like chew, and then next he uses a word we might translate into something like gnaw. It's like he uses increasingly physical imagery. I think that the intention is we're supposed to receive him as food. Now, often, I mean, the wafer is so small, I often just wait for it to soften and then swallow it. But I think there's nothing, to be gained necessarily by that versus just chewing the host.
Yeah, other than the fact that it would, well, no, it wouldn't.
What?
I was going to say it would remain the host longer, but no, I don't think it would.
Oh, no.
The chemical process, once it soaks up your saliva, has begun.
It started. That's right.
Once it hits your stomach, it's
going to dissolve.
5 minutes?
Probably, probably no more than that. So,
okay.
That's
I don't have too much more of an argument, but I will hear people say I'm not worthy to put him on my hands, which is
if you're not.
Doesn't make
that's
sense
the thing.
to me.
The worthiness is. That's what the gift of grace is. We only receive communion when we're in a state of grace. And if we're not worthy, we're not worthy. Whether on the hands or on the tongue.
And if you're not worthy to put it on your hand, you're not worthy to put it on your tongue.
Mm-hmm. Right,
and
exactly.
It's a lot like saying, I'm not worthy to kiss my wife, but we'll have sex. Because one is much more intimate than the other.
Right, exactly. That's exactly a good point. Now, again, I think this had to do with maybe some of the Jewish mindset about some things, but in the early church, I think I've read that there are some incidences or some accounts of people. I don't know if it was like they were told not to do this by church leaders or if they just took it on themselves to think of it this way. But for example, people who might have, prior to becoming Christian, used their hands to carve idols or something for the, the common religious worship or something like that. Those particular people, I've read that they would refrain from touching the host with their hands because their hands had been used for such a sinful purpose or such an evil purpose. And so they might, for that, avoid that.
Yeah.
But I think that's part of the idea of the grace of Christ that when we say in the Psalm, you say, blot out all of my guilt, or I think Isaiah, you've saved me from the pit when you cast my sins behind you, stuff like that. I think that's meant to apply for the whole person, and so we can't say, well, gee, our tongue was forgiven, but our hands weren't. I don't think I don't think it works theologically to talk like that.
My toes are still waiting.
Well, it starts at the toes. That's why Jesus said, I'm going to wash your feet.
Well, I think you guys you touched on something else that we'll probably save for a different podcast, and that's going to the chalice, taking the chalice. So that's I always have.
Yeah.
So I don't always. It just depends on how many people are there or whatever. But I generally do. So I want to have that conversation sometime too.
Yeah. Okay. Let's do that. I could say I don't, but what I do, because I want to try to draw people's attention to what this is, as after I receive communion, if they have people, holding the chalice there afterwards, I will stop and make a profound bow to Jesus as present in the chalice before going back to my pew.
You're one of those people.
I am one of those
people. You hold up the whole line.
I do.
Because you want to stop and bow.
For a whole second and a half.
Well...
Okay, so what about current events?
Hey,
we'll save the big one for the last.
What's the big one?
The big one is Trump.
Okay.
Trump.
We'll save that for last.
Okay, so there was I don't know how to say this, Asia Bibi?
I think,
in Pakistan.
Mm-hmm.
She was sentenced to death for some kind of blasphemy.
Wasn't she?
And,
she was arrested, right?
Yeah,
and the way I understand
the court overturned her death sentence.
That's good. So that's a good
So she's
news.
not going to be put to death.
Right.
I wonder, what do they stone them there? Or?
Who knows? I mean, they'd probably behead her. Would have beheaded her or something. But
They're a bunch of sickos.
Well, and the thing is, the so-called blasphemy was. I don't. Are you familiar with the story, Jason?
No.
Not really. No. Just
Okay, so my understanding is that she like drank out of the same, like while she was in jail or something. She was arrested, I think, for being a Christian, and I should go look all this up because I just hear snippets. But my understanding is that she was arrested as a Christian for being a Christian, and then her big blasphemy was that while she was in prison, she drank out of the same bucket as a Muslim or something like that, who must have been in prison for another purpose or for another reason. I don't know. The thing is, it's one of those things that is so bizarre, that she was even being, considered for the death penalty. It's like, it just shows you how, how these countries are and how they think, and how, wow, if the first world countries thought this way,
oh gosh.
The level of persecution, and the thing is, it really is targeted at Christians.
Oh, absolutely.
It always is.
Absolutely.
I mean, they persecute Jews as well. Okay, so but Jews are just Christians who haven't, quite crossed the line yet, right? Well, that's
right.
true.
No, I'm kidding. But there's a different kind of persecution for Christians, though.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's really bad in some parts of the world, and we don't talk about it enough here at all.
Yep.
Not at all.
Well, anyway, she's going to be allowed to live. Apparently, she's probably spend the rest of her life in prison, so
yeah.
It doesn't matter. But I think we'll probably still end up being allowed to call her a martyr.
Yeah,
Sure.
yeah.
Okay, NASA's got two big things. First of all, Kepler, the spacecraft, is out of energy now. So Kepler was no more exoplanet data, and it supposedly found 2,600 exoplanets. And how that worked is it would continue to look at a star and watch if that star got lighter or darker and then brighter again, to signify that a planet crossed its path and blocked out the light, and
to indicate a solar system type.
Yeah, but see, that only works if the
planet is big.
Not even that. It only works if the axis for its
right. Let's
orbit
cross in front of the planet relative to our view.
Yeah, and even then, you don't know if it's going to cross directly in front of the sun or if it goes, above it or below it. And
so how would they distinguish between that and like a binary star system? Because a binary star system, you would expect, while the two stars are arranged, both of them, you can see both of them. You wouldn't see them as two stars. You just see a brighter star. And when they're one behind the other, it would look like a single star.
Yeah, but the star would not necessarily block the energy coming from the star behind it, would it?
Oh, you mean you think it would
would the energy just go through that other star and just magnify, or?
I don't think so. I don't know.
Is there
I'll have to look into that. That's
I don't know, but I mean, a lot of that it also has to do with timing. It has to not just see it get dark and then bright once. It has to see it a number of times, and
on a periodic. Right.
And then also look for the wobble of the star to see if it moves, a little bit to the left and then a little bit to the right according to where the planet is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's amazing they can build the instrumentation to sense that, subtle changes.
Yeah, it's insane.
In stars, and it's built into a little satellite that's not a satellite, but a a vehicle that's like out there in deep space sending the data back. That's what Kepler is, right?
Yeah. So I guess it's not in our solar system anymore, and I guess that's why it ran out of fuel, and or maybe it's in our solar system, but it's far away enough to where it can't get anything from the sun, I guess. I don't know. But also they've got a solar probe that got within, 26.6 million miles from the sun. That's the closest we've been able to get anything to the sun.
Have any of you heard of this thing called trunk or treating?
Trunk or treating?
No.
You haven't heard that? Okay,
like a tree trunk?
No, like a car trunk. So instead of trick or treating, trunk or treating.
Like in a parking lot or something?
Yeah. So like.
I mean, I've seen that.
You've seen it.
Well, the church down the street from us is a little Methodist church. They would just all line up with their cars, and the kids would go down there and just go along from car to car.
Okay, so am I the only one who thinks that it's kind of going in the wrong direction to teach kids to accept candy out of the trunks of cars?
I haven't thought about it that much. They did something similar in this area last year because it was raining or something, and they wanted to make it quicker or easier for the kids. I don't know.
Oh yeah, they had them go to the field house.
Yeah, or something.
And the kids. Okay, yeah, I remember that. But still, everybody went trick or treating.
Yes.
I mean, there was still a bunch of neighborhood kids running around the streets, and there were a bunch of houses with candy. Oh well.
So what are you saying about Trump?
Birthright Citizenship. The 14th Amendment in the Constitution was put there because, we had all these slaves. And the southern states were trying to, they'll say, fine, okay, we can't have slavery, but they took so many rights away from them that they practically were slaves. So the idea was, the Congress said, well, wait a minute, we'll put a stop to that by amending the Constitution to make it to where each one of these slaves are citizens of the U.S. and have all the rights of citizenship.
Right. And to the precise language is all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside.
Right.
And then it goes on to say that you can't abridge rights of citizens and stuff like that.
Right. And the writer of that, the one who wrote that, wrote about it later, saying obviously, like ambassadors, their children born in the U.S. would not be U.S. citizens. This is specifically for people under the jurisdiction of our government. Illegal aliens are not under the jurisdiction of our government. And that is why they should not...
It says all persons born in the United States.
And subject to the jurisdiction thereof.
So the question is, illegal alien has a child. Is the child subject to the jurisdiction of the United States?
No. The question is the illegal alien subject of the... Yeah, all persons born to or naturalized in the United States and
subject to the jurisdiction thereof.
They're talking about the one being born, not...
Any person born in the United States and subject to the United States jurisdiction is a citizen. Constitutionally.
So,
all persons born or naturalized.
Naturalized is the process by which a state makes a person a citizen who wasn't born here.
So we can take out the word naturalized for a second.
Right.
All persons born in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction of United States.
Right.
So the question is, are ambassadors subject to the jurisdictions of the United States? Are their children subject to the jurisdiction of the United States?
Right.
Evidently not.
And I don't believe they are. because they were specifically not meant to become citizens. Now, if someone sneaks in just to have a child here,
is the child subject to the jurisdiction? Well, here's it's kind of a catch. It's a kind of a catch-22 for the parent, because if the child is subject to the jurisdiction of the United States and the parent isn't, does that mean that the parent then gives up their civic family, natural family rights over the child?
But they don't, and what they've been doing is coming here, having a baby, then going back home. And now they've got a child who can at any time come back to the United States, which is not what this amendment was meant to do. This amendment was meant to give citizenship to freed slaves after the Civil War.
Right. And to continue to grant citizenship to anyone born, primarily the idea was born of citizens, but also born of immigrants. So let's take
Italian
illegals out of the case,
but
let's say they don't become citizens. Let's say they don't naturalize, but they spend their life here and raise a child here. The child's subject to the jurisdiction of the United States and was born here. The child's a citizen. So it's meant to cover those kinds of cases as well. Now,
except when the immigrant isn't meant to be here. Isn't supposed to be here.
That's the question. So let's go back to the case of the ambassador. So an ambassador typically, they're presumed to have residence in like the embassy or something like that.
Usually, but if they're having a baby, they're probably at the hospital.
Going to go to a hospital, right? And I think there's kind of an understanding of, okay, they're not going to travel back to their country to have the baby, so they're going to go ahead and use the hospital, but their residence is the embassy, and it's kind of like, okay, I was born at the hospital, but the residence of my birth is my home, where my parents lived when I was born, right?
Yeah.
So, and I think that same concept applies. So the child's not, even in that case, born in the United States. Now, here's the thing. What about somebody who's just visiting the United States? They just want to go on a long vacation. Okay.
Well,
now, I don't know if we let people take year-long vacations, but for the sake of the question, let's put it out there. Somebody comes in, a young couple, they have maybe a lot of free time and a lot of money, so we're going to stay in the United States for a year. No, we're not citizens. We're just visiting. We're on vacation.
You're dragging us out.
Well, here's the thing. They have a baby while they're there. Is the baby?
Yeah, I know.
I don't think that baby's a citizen.
I don't think he is either.
I don't think. Well, hold on. What if the parents don't want him to be?
So is it to the parents' discretion?
No, that's my point. Is the parents clearly don't intend to move to and live in the United States and make themselves subject to the United States as their residence.
But they purposely come here to have children so that their children are able to.
I'm talking about parents who don't purposely. I'm talking about parents who just happen to be here vacationing with no intention of their child being a citizen.
We would still consider them citizens under the way things are right now.
Under the way people want to argue, I would say that this amendment is not intended to make that child a citizen.
Right.
And therefore also would not be intended to make the children of immigrants citizens if those immigrants don't also intend to become citizens and live in the United States.
I know a guy from the Philippines, but his parents, when his mom was like 8 months pregnant, came here to visit the U.S. so that she could come back later with her citizen-born son, even though he didn't even speak the language.
Yeah, it's kind of the wording of the amendment created a loophole, and honestly, this amendment was written at a time when the United States lawmakers were getting kind of sloppy with words, and they were getting kind of sloppy with thought. But under the circumstances, it kind of needed to be done. but the wording it created a big loophole that it simply was not. It didn't intend to give that kind of loophole.
I don't think it had that loophole until Kennedy did something to try to. I think this happened under Kennedy for a long time.
Well, the wording of the amendment hasn't changed.
Yeah, I know. But there's something else that goes with it, and I can't remember what it is. I'm going to have to look it up. But because Kennedy reopened immigration for America. And this
that's
was
fine.
part of his deal.
That's immigration as in terms of letting people come in and live here. That's not a constitutional thing. That's just,
Right.
But, I think, consider this was written in a time when people weren't nearly as mobile. If somebody was coming to the United States, it's because they were immigrating. Not because they were going to come here, have a kid, and leave.
Or come here and work for one season and leave.
Or whatever, right. It wasn't migrant workers either.
This did not apply to Native Americans either.
That's right, because they weren't subject to the jurisdiction of the government.
Yeah. Well, either way, he said it, and he said he thinks he can change it by executive order.
It'll be interesting. I need to go read what he said.
I'll have to see what he does, but at least we're talking about it, because I think this has been a problem for a while, and I think it is one of those things that needs to be dealt with.
He didn't say he necessarily would change it either. He was just
he said,
I
think I can. I
can. Yeah.
So, and let me put this out there though. With all of the problems, look at this caravan of immigrants thing, and the immigrants that are coming in all the time illegally with the purpose of staying here and working, or with the purpose of coming in and out and running drugs and that kind of stuff. How big of a problem is this birthright loophole relative to all the rest of the southern border immigrant problem?
Well, it kind of created the problem that we have parents who aren't supposed to be here and children who are supposed to be here, and us not knowing what to do with them.
Okay, but is that a significant portion of the immigrants that we consider the problem?
Yeah.
Or is that just like 5% of them? I don't know what the percentages are.
I bet a very high percentage of the people who are here who aren't supposed to be here have family members who are allowed to be here because they're citizens.
And specifically children.
Right. So what are we going to do with these kids? And then what are we going to do with the parents? Are we going to send them all back, or are we going to let the kids stay? And what's the age limit? If an 18-year-old kid, we could let him stay because he's a citizen. Well, we got a 2-year-old kid who's a citizen of the U.S., and the parents aren't supposed to be here and never were supposed to be here. What are we supposed to do now?
Mm-hmm.
And if we don't fix that loophole, we're going to keep having this problem, and we could ignore it for 15 years, and then it won't be a problem if we fix the loophole.
Right. Yeah, so a couple things. I guess the one of the things is because there's this subject to the jurisdiction thereof clause. If the United States, if the government were to define their jurisdiction over persons such that they don't that these people are not necessarily subject to the jurisdiction of the United States, that would also be a way to eliminate this citizenship loophole for them.
Yeah.
And they would still be able to deport them, because even though they're not, the person isn't subject to the jurisdiction of the United States, well, the place that they're living in is.
Right.
Or at least subject to the jurisdiction of the state that they live in.
Well, no matter what they do, it's one more case of Trump just kind of stealing the media for however long he wants. And it's like he keeps his foot down on their necks. And every time they think they're done talking about him and they got something on him, he says something else to piss everyone off, and he never lets up. But let's see, in a couple more days here, we're going to find out how effective it was.
That's true. I voted. I did my part.
Oh, you already voted?
Mm-hmm.
I have not voted yet.
Yeah, they've got early voting in Indiana where they've got all of the normal voting venues are open for early voting. You don't even have to go to the Board of Elections.
Oh,
did you vote, Jason?
So you can just... No, not yet. I'm planning to go Tuesday.
Have you changed your address, or you got to come over to Chivy? At
No, I changed my address.
Did you
Jason
re-register?
moved.
Yeah, I changed it to the new address, and we got a letter telling us where the polling place is.
Oh, good. Okay.
I did, but my kids did not. So my kids have to go back to Cleves to
vote.
Oh,
well, wherever they go,
so
it's important they do.
What's this podcast about?
Catholic things.
Catholic things.
But we always have a segment where we talk about, secular
Catholics
current
live in
events,
current events too.
That's true. That's true.
It affects us.
That's true.
Okay, well, thanks for listening to a podcast about Catholic things, and think about what we said, and we'll see you next week.
All right.
Take care,
everyone.
folks. Bye.